documentary theater in this special program. Today we're going to talk about the most famous man you've never heard of, and he had the most peculiar name. His name is Odd McIntyre, the highest paid and most read reporter of his era, who achieved great fame and fortune in the early decades of the 20th century. In his daily column about New York, Odd recorded what was happening backstage and behind the scenes with popular culture in the city and around the world. He was close friends with many of the leading personalities of the day, including Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Will Rogers, George Gershwin, and Charlie Chaplin. Odd wrote about entertainment, media, and politics, and his columns provide a unique glimpse into one of the most fascinating periods in American popular culture. Joining us today is the man whose new book, an odd book, How the First Modern Pop Culture Reporter Conquered New York, provides the definitive biography of the famous columnist. Scott Williams is the Chief Operating Officer and Senior Vice President of Sales and Marketing here at the Newseum. He joined the Newseum in 2012, and prior to that was Vice President of Marketing for Elvis Presley Enterprises in Memphis, where he worked for 12 years. He currently serves on the board of the D.C. chapter of the American Advertising Federation and on the board of the Historical Society of Washington, D.C. Please help me welcome Scott Williams. Thank you. So Scott, tell me, how did you land on Odd McIntyre as a book subject? And I want to ask a question that a book agent once asked you. Why do you think anyone would want to buy a book about a person everyone has forgotten? How did he answer
Sure,
that?
thank you. So, first of all, thank you everybody for letting me come and share this book with you here today. I was originally researching another book that I wrote on Richard Halliburton, and I ran across a few things that Odd McIntyre had written. And so I pulled it aside and made a note, if I ever write another book, this is somebody I want to explore writing about. At the same time, though, I was sort of considering a book about Elvis and the media. I thought that would be an interesting book. So, and Colonel Parker, and so
you certainly know a lot about Elvis.
I know a little bit about Elvis, not
right.
as much as many of my Elvis
Right.
fan friends, but I do know a few things about Elvis, and so I thought that would be an interesting topic to explore Elvis and the media and how Colonel Parker used the media. I then did a little bit more research. And finally decided that Odd is the one that I'm the most interested in. So for a book, and I thought, since no one else had written about him, the more I researched, the more I dug, the more I read, the more I looked, it seemed like somebody who was both worthy of a book and also somebody for whom people would find interest.
Right. Well, let's talk a little bit about him and his upbringing. Tell us a little bit about that and how he got into the newspaper business.
Sure. So Odd was raised by his grandmother in Gallipolis, Ohio. His mother had died when he was 4, and so his grandmother raised him in a very typical Ohio turn-of-the-century childhood, except for the fact that he had a very difficult time with school. He had struggled very much so with math. He didn't pay attention. He skipped school a lot. But the one thing he did love was the newspaper business.
Yeah.
So instead of doing his homework and his schoolwork, he made little newspapers of the neighbors. He would boil glue to make scrapbooks, glue pictures and newspaper articles, and he had a family friend who subscribed to magazines like Judge and Puck, which were magazines like Mad Magazine today. And so he really just started making magazines and newspapers on his own. Well, eventually he got a job in the newspaper business in the town, and even though he wasn't super educated, he didn't do well with spelling and grammar, he still did a great job at writing observational copy and on writing things that people really understood and could relate to.
Right. And he certainly got into the newspaper business at a different time than, of course, today. I mean, tell us a little bit about the newspaper business at that time. And certainly he did make his way to New York, where there were, a dozen newspapers.
Right. Yeah. It was really, he was successful for a lot of reasons, I think, ultimately. Yeah. But one of the reasons he was successful is that previously newspapers had been for the wealthy and for people who could afford buy the newspaper because they were very expensive. So Odd wrote in a style that suddenly, as more and more people who could afford newspapers but newspapers started to become cheaper, so more and more people could buy newspapers that could relate to the style in which Odd wrote, and so he started gaining in popularity. So when he would get a job in a newspaper in a town like in Dayton, Ohio, or Cincinnati, and his style of writing was so unique that it would attract the attention of editors for other papers who tried to even emulate, in some cases, how he wrote. Now, he definitely needed a good editor who could make sure things were spelled right and typographically right.
As we all do. So before we get to his New York days, tell us about his time at the Cincinnati Post. He was side by side with some pretty influential journalists there.
Yeah, that was one of the most interesting things to me as well. You know, Cincinnati was a lot like all the other cities at the time, and there was a city boss named Boss Cox, and he ruled with an iron fist. But because there was a individual person who was ruling the town, Cincinnati missed out on a lot of important things like health care and good education and transportation. And so as things were changing from the Victorian era and becoming more modernized, these bosses were keeping progress from taking place. So really smart, talented young people working for newspapers started seeing where they could write about these injustices that were going on. They could write about these things that were going badly, and they could make a difference. They could actually see change. And so Odd was part of a group of people, including some of the biggest muckrakers that we've all heard of today, like Ida Tarbell and Lincoln Steffens. And so he was right there with them, observing them. Now his skills were very different than theirs, but by working with them, he really learned to appreciate what they were doing, and was part of this big cause to bring down this injustice in this town.
Right. So once he arrives in New York, tell us about what kind of drew him to the world of pop culture and entertainment that he ended up becoming so famous covering.
Sure. So even from the very beginning, when he was young, he loved the theater, and Odd worked as an usher so that he could see the plays for free. He then in each town that he would go to, he would go to the plays, and he loved the music, and he really liked entertainment. He eventually, in New York, here he was in a city where the transitions in entertainment were significant. So you were going from what had been vaudeville to the more Broadway productions that we know of today. Broadway was just beginning. Tin Pan Alley was happening. So he eventually got a job. He got fired from pretty much every job as a reporter that he had, because as it turns out, being able to spell correctly and use proper grammar was important. So he kept getting fired over and over and over again. He also suffered from really, really bad depression. He suffered from obsessive compulsive disorder, all brought on, I think, by pernicious anemia, which was undiagnosed. But he eventually got a job on Tin Pan Alley as a publicist. And PR was a very new job to have, but as it turned out, because of his appreciation for entertainment, because of his ability to know the newspaper industry from the inside, he made the perfect publicist. So he got to know all of the songwriters and the entertainers and the people who were doing publishing work on Tin Pan Alley. He then, from that job, ended up working for Florence Ziegfeld for a number of years as his publicist. And so from there, he really became at the top of the entertainment business in New York. He was suffering from really bad depression. You haven't asked me this, but I was going to keep on going. Do you want to ask me about the depression? Or
Tell us about his depression and how that affected his career.
He finally lost his job. He had a job at Hampton's Magazine, and he was so depressed. He was lying in bed for 3 weeks. He couldn't get out of bed. He was that depressed. He was sobbing, and his wife didn't know exactly what to do to help him. And so she reminded him that he had been doing a really great job of writing letters back home to his friends in Gallipolis. So she said, why don't you just write a letter and let me send it out as a column? And so he was able to get out of bed, that motivated him to write. And she bought a mimeograph machine with the tiny bit of money that they had, and started mimeographing the columns every day and sending them out to newspapers all over the country.
Wow.
And so while he was working on Tin Pan Alley, while he was working for Ziegfeld, what he would do at night is come home and write those columns. And that's what he truly loved, and that's what he truly wanted to do, because that was the newspaper business, and that's what he enjoyed.
And that's how his column began.
And that's
what was the name of his column?
It was called different things by different newspapers, but most of them called it New York Day by Day, because he would basically tell people in other parts of the country what was happening in New York, in the entertainment business, in politics and sports, the things he saw, the things he communicated to people who would never get to visit New York, what was actually going on there. And he pitched the idea to numerous syndicators, but they were turned down over and over and over again until they just did it themselves. And then it took about 10 years for it to take off. And when eventually they were able to get a real syndicator, McNaught Syndicates, to sign a deal with them, his wife was able to negotiate the highest paid contract for any columnist in history at that point.
Wow. One thing that you write about, or you say in the some of the press that you're doing about the book, is that you read every one of Odd's daily columns. You sat in the Library of Congress, or
all over the place.
All over the place, and so you read about 30,000 of his columns.
A lot of. I mean, I skimmed some.
So, okay, yeah, right. But from 1970 to 1938, tell us. I mean, what did you think of him as a writer, first of all?
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting was the way he was able to communicate he was able to communicate a great deal with a very few words, and so there was a pattern to the way that he wrote. Some people back then wrote right after his death that they suspected his wife had been the one at the end that was actually writing the columns, but I don't believe so, because you can absolutely tell his writing and his style was very, very specific and done in a very interesting way. So, I think he was a fascinating writer, and in a lot of ways it's a lot like poetry, the way that he wrote. In some cases, he wrote sections of his column that were thoughts while strolling, is what he called it, and it was really just random thoughts of things that he supposedly saw while he was strolling. Right. Of course, he was in his study, writing that usually, but it's very poetic to read the way that he wrote and the way that he observed the pop culture of that day.
Of all those thousands of columns that you read or skimmed, were there any stand out? Can you look back and remember one or two or three that made you laugh or made you cry or just kind of really stood out to you?
Sure, I don't cry.
Okay.
But
I do on a daily basis.
The one that kind of made me smile the most, because I don't really laugh that much either, but I did smile. Most people have heard about the Algonquin Round Table, which was in the 20s, a group of really smart, witty young people came together. They were editors and authors and critics.
It's like a staff meeting at the museum.
Absolutely, no doubt.
Right.
And so they would meet every single day for lunch. So they weren't really hard workers, like that's at the museum. But they met every day for lunch, and they would make fun of other people, and they would have witty barbs they would toss back and forth, and they were very full of themselves in a lot of ways, from what I've read. Well, they did not like Odd McIntyre at all, and he did not like them, and so he wrote, some negative things from time to time about individuals, and he definitely wrote as though he felt left out. And his mother-in-law actually lived in the Algonquin Hotel, so he was there all the time. The owner of the Algonquin was always trying to get him into the group, and he would always, stand off, and they didn't like anyway. So in around 1932, which is, the Algonquin Round Table kind of ended in the late 20s. But in 1932, he wrote just one little sentence in a column with a lot of other things. I wonder whatever happened to the Algonquin Round Table, which to me was kind of passive aggressive and like the ultimate insult for these people who derived off of all this publicity. So he kind of put them in their place in a way. So I thought that was funny.
Well, he became friends with so many of the people he wrote about. Ernest Hemingway, Charlie Chaplin, Rudolph Valentino. If he ever came upon dirt on any of these people, would he not write about them? How were you able to figure that out in your research?
Yeah, he was absolutely not an investigative journalist.
Okay.
And he received a lot of criticism from reporters of the day because there were already there was yellow journalism had happened decades before, and he was not adhering to the rules of journalism.
Okay.
And so he received a lot of criticism. If he had received dirt on someone who was his friend,
Yeah.
Absolutely. Valentino, as an example, said, I feel like that if you write about me, it puts our friendship in an awkward position where you not write about me.
Right.
So he didn't.
Right.
Until after his death.
Yeah.
So, he and Odd even said, his goal was to entertain people a little every day. So he was an entertainer who functioned in the realm of journalism.
Did he make any enemies in his career? Did he have? You mentioned the Algonquin.
The Algonquin Round Table folks didn't
Yeah.
like him.
Yeah.
Walter Winchell and
Yes.
he were very much. You would really call them enemies.
Yeah.
Because Walter Winchell was cruel, and called him Mick Tiresome.
Ooh.
Yeah, and the very odd McIntyre.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
which was it's painful.
Right. We're going to get to some questions from the audience, so please, if you have one, just raise your hand and we'll get to you. I want to ask, you mentioned Maybelle, his wife.
Yes.
She played a big role in his life, right?
She did, yeah.
Certainly, you mentioned that she basically kind of started the column by sending it out to all these
Right.
folks. But tell us a little bit about her. And she lived to be 101 years old.
101.
Yeah.
She died in the 80s in a nursing home.
Right.
But which to me was kind of that would be an interesting way to start the movie.
Mm-hmm.
To have her in the nursing home thinking back.
Right.
Yeah.
He's thinking big, aren't you?
So, I mean, she and Odd were from the same town. They grew up right down the street from each other. He started courting her when they were like in the 6th grade. She was only interested in him ever, and he was only interested in her, and so but they didn't get married until later. So when they were in their 20s, they got married when he didn't want to get married until he could actually support her. They finally did get married. They moved to New York, and then she really had her hands full because he, in addition to the depression we talked about, he had such horrible issues with obsessive compulsive disorder. And so he was afraid to go out in public because he was afraid people would brush lint off of his shoulder.
Yeah.
He was afraid to speak to anyone the second time they met. There was a lot of, he would not leave the house at all, but yet he also didn't want her to leave the house. So of course they didn't know about pernicious anemia or obsessive compulsive disorder at the time. So she hung in there when a lot of people probably would not have. And then she was the one who was sort of the face of the couple and negotiated great money for him, negotiated a lot of really great deals. So she was the businesswoman of the family, and they ended up living in a great, really great apartment. He died when he was 54, and so she, she took the money and traveled a little bit, but stayed in New York. And before he died, they had bought a house together in Gallipolis, Ohio, that was actually her family home, and they fixed it up from New York. They had never laid eyes on it. They bought it and then spent 4 years fixing it up from a distance. They had family members who would go in and decorate it the way they wanted it decorated. And so the first time that they saw this house they had spent all this time on in Gallipolis was when they shipped his body there for the visitation. And the visitation was in their house. They called it Gatewood. And I got to tour the house when I was doing the research.
Cool.
And then she would come back in the summer times and spend some time there. And she was very involved in the community there in Gallipolis. So there's a lot of, I only got to speak to a few people, but when I go there for an event on April 22nd, I have since met people who knew her, who are anxious to tell me some more stories about her.
Very neat. Before we get to questions, you are COO of the museum. That keeps you here late at night for all the wonderful programs we do. And I'm just wondering when you find the time to kind of write and research this book.
At night and on the weekends.
Yeah.
It's sort of like golf,
Right.
only more expensive.
Right. Right.
So Yeah, no, I mean, it combines a lot of interests that I have, which is reading and doing research and history. I love history, and of course journalism and news. I love that, and so yeah, I mean, it's honestly fun. And I do have to try to do it when I can. That's why it took 2 years to do it.
Yeah. Well, let's open it up to the audience here. Yeah, there's one over there, sir.
Yeah, what do you think Odd's favorite social media channel would be?
So the question was, what's Odd's favorite social media channel?
Odd would absolutely tweet. Yeah, because what he wrote was very short and very succinct, and I mean, I'm trying to pull out some of his things he wrote and tweak them.
Yes.
You can go to anoddbook.com and go down to the bottom and see the Twitter feed. And I mean, I think he would have loved Twitter because he loved short, succinct, witty little statements.
Right. It's like our president. Yes, sir.
I have a two-part question.
Yes.
One, when the movie is made, who should play?
Okay.
My second question would it be a comedy or a drama?
When the movie is made,
I'm taking my answer out here.
who plays Odd in the movie, and is it a comedy or a drama? That's just for the Facebook Live feed post.
I believe that it would be a drama. And the arc of the story would be, someone starts off with very little skill, with suffering from a terrible mental illness. They go to New York during one of the most exciting times in history. They struggle, but yet they persevere. They keep pushing through. They keep trying. They find huge success. I mean, you cannot imagine how successful he was, because everything he wrote was seen by 100 million people every day. Compared to, like the evening late shows and things like that, if they get 2 or 3 million people, then they feel like they're successful. If he wrote in an article, "I sure do miss blackberry jam," he would get cases and cases and cases sent to him from all over the country, and he would donate them to a hospital because he was generous, but also because he was afraid of being poisoned. So, so he would keep any or eat any of it. But but then, after all that success, he did the constant wear and tear of the disease, the constant insults. He did start to get torn down, and in the end, he really didn't go out much. He would go out in his limousine, and just like they would park the limousine across from a theater opening, and he and his wife and his dog would sit in the limousine watching from the back seat, because the disease also took a physical toll, and he physically couldn't even move. So he would just sit, and he would write just a little bit, but he had a very hard time with even that. So I think that would be sort of the arc of the story. And I've been honestly thinking, who would I cast if I were doing the movie? Who would I cast? And I don't know. I can't. For me, his image is so specific, so succinct.
Kevin Spacey.
You think Kevin Spacey?
That's not bad.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let's get together and do the movie.
I like it. I like it. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I wondered if Odd had any particular scoops, given his friendliness with so many of the pop culture figures, if he had gotten any great stories.
Yeah, he actually had a lot of great stories, and at first, because he was writing to entertain, he tended to elaborate just a little bit. So I did have to go back, and that made it even harder to research.
We should note that you mentioned in the book that some people accused him of, or he did make up. He did make up things.
Yeah. He did make up things.
Right.
He exaggerated.
Yeah,
And so I had to go back and double check to see if the things that he said really did happen. Check other ways. And so a couple of things that there's proof that he actually did. He very early on, way before they were famous, when he was working in Dayton, had heard about a couple of brothers who were working on a flying machine, and so he did write in his unpublished biography, kind of a journal that he kept, about going to the Wright brothers' house and knocking on the door, and what that experience was like, to try to get a story out of them. They didn't want any newspaper coverage, and they were very private, So it was hard to get much to write, but he did write a little bit of story for filler for his newspaper. It was one of the first things he wrote in Dayton, and so that was a scoop that was interesting. Another one, when he was working in Dayton, he had been sort of demoted repeatedly until he had a really bad job at the newspaper where he could do very little damage. He was like a telegraph operator, in a sense. And this happened. I noticed this happened over and over and over again in his life. Somebody came in who had authority, who saw something in him that they didn't see in other people, and so they promoted him to a higher position. And in this case, the new editor that came in when the Titanic sank, he had to pick somebody to lead the reporters, to lead the coverage, and so he sent Odd to be on the dock when the people were exiting off of the Carpathia, and so Odd got to interview a lot of those people as they were exiting. So a lot of the stories that we hear about, I noticed he actually wrote a lot of them. So I thought that was interesting. And then there were a lot of he was right there with, like, Will Rogers was one of his very best friends, and so he wrote about the crash afterwards that killed Will Rogers, and so he had a lot of very interesting insight on actors and actresses and politicians and business people there in New York. So it wouldn't necessarily be scoop as much as it would be inside observations.
Yes, ma'am. No other.
Where does the name Odd come from?
Yes, Odd, right?
It
is pronounced Odd, right?
It is. I asked
Yeah,
a lot of people
yeah.
who knew his wife, did they pronounce it Odd? And they said yes. But Odd is the way they pronounced it. His uncle's name was Odd McIntyre, and so they named his mother, who died early, named him after his uncle.
So it's a family name.
It's a family name. Yeah. It's an odd
Sir.
name.
You mentioned how Mrs. Odd, at the time when he was virtually bedridden with depression, came up with the idea that she would write his columns.
Mm-hmm.
And I would infer from that she was maybe a better speller, a grammarian.
I do. She did edit the things that he wrote, but only for a while. But he also would only write while she was in the room. And if she strayed too far, especially as he got older and the disease took more hold, if she would leave, he would get really full of anxiety. So she stayed really close. And the image behind me, the type underneath, is actually one of his columns that he had worked on. And he had a very specific way that he worked, which was very different than anyone else. But he made so much money for the syndicator that they were willing to put up with this strange way that he worked. But he would write his articles in paragraphs, and then he would cut them out, and then he would go through and write in red and move the words around, and then he would go back and try to paste them together to create an actual column. But he would try to create 2 a day. That way he always had backup, because he was always afraid he was going to die. And so he always wanted to keep extra ones. And so my hope when I was doing the research is that I would find this huge crate of unseen articles but I never did. But so he would then send that to the syndicator's office, and they would have to take that and turn it into the column, which then went out, across the nation.
One last question. What do you hope people get out of this book when they read it?
I hope that people there's 2 things. One, of course, I hope that people know that if they have a dream that they want to pursue, not to give up the first time you get turned down, to keep looking for different ways. He wanted to be in the newspaper business, and every way he tried failed. Mm-hmm. And finally, he found a way that he could be in the newspaper business using the skills that he had. So he had a dream, and he just kept pursuing it. And so I think everybody should do that. Pursue your dream and look for different ways you can execute it. Secondly, I just think it's a fascinating study of his life and his career, and the things he did is a fascinating study of the shift in how people communicate and what a group of young people can do when they're working together with a brand new medium, and how they can apply that to make the world a better place. And I think, even though we're not young, you're young, you're younger than me. We're in a time where we all have a brand new mediums. The changes in technology, the changes in journalism, it's all happening so fast all around us, and we all have a great opportunity to really be in the middle of this great change, just like the young people were in the 20s that were using journalism to make a difference then.
Right. Tell us how we can purchase copies of this book.
You can, all of you can go to the gift store here at the Newseum,
right.
but you can go to Amazon and search an odd book, and it will come up, or you can go to anoddbook.com and follow all the little social media things at the bottom.
The book is An Odd Book. That's the title. The author is R. Scott Williams. Thank you all for joining us here, and thank you, Mr. Williams, for being here.